The mansion was beautiful, a place most people could only dream of. Its tall glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, the marble floors shined like mirrors, and the walls were decorated with expensive paintings collected from around the world. In the large garden outside, fountains danced gracefully, and flowers of every color bloomed. From the outside, the millionaire's home looked perfect. But inside, behind the glitter and the gold, there was sadness no amount of money could hide. The millionaire and his wife had been blessed with twin children, a boy and a girl. When they were born, the house was filled with joy, and the parents celebrated their arrival with grand parties. The twins were dressed in the finest clothes, given the softest cribs, and surrounded with toys that most children could never imagine. Their parents promised to give them the best life, one where nothing would ever be missing. But as the months passed, something became clear. The babies were not responding like other children. When their mother waved her hand in front of their eyes, they did not follow the movement. When their father held up a colorful toy, they did not smile or reach out. The truth slowly revealed itself. Both twins were blind. The news broke their parents' hearts. They went from doctor to doctor, hoping someone would say it was just a mistake, that their children would one day see the light. The best specialists were flown in from across the world. Some promised new treatments, others suggested expensive surgeries. But each attempt ended with the same painful words, "There is nothing we can do." The twins grew older, and the reality of their blindness shaped their lives. They lived in a world of darkness. They could not run through the gardens like other children, chasing butterflies or playing hide and seek. They could not see the grand chandeliers in the house, the shining pools, or the glittering stars in the night sky. While other children their age laughed and played freely, the twins clung to the safety of their mother's dress or the sound of their father's voice. The parents tried to give them happiness. They filled the house with toys that made sounds, with soft dolls, talking gadgets, and anything that might make their children feel less different. But no toy could replace the joy of sight. The children often sat quietly in their room, holding each other's hands, speaking only to themselves. Their laughter was rare, their smiles fading as the days went on. The mother often cried in silence. She watched other children play in the park and wondered why life had chosen her twins for such a struggle. The father, a man known for solving problems and creating wealth from nothing, felt powerless for the first time in his life. He could buy anything in the world, but he could not buy light for his children's eyes. Their home, though full of riches, grew heavy with sadness. The staff moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, as though even their joy might disturb the fragile peace. The parents stopped hosting parties. The fountains still danced, the lights still glowed, but the heart of the home was quiet. The twins themselves struggled in ways they could not explain. They were not spoiled or demanding children. They were gentle, but their world felt small. Every step had to be cautious, every movement guided. They held onto walls, counting their steps from one room to another, afraid of bumping into furniture. Sometimes, frustration boiled over. They cried not because they wanted more toys or more treats, but because they wanted freedom, the freedom to run, to see, to live like others. At night, when the mansion fell silent, the parents often sat by their children's beds, whispering promises. "We will find a way," the father said, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "You will never be alone," the mother whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. But deep down, they feared their promises were empty. And so the days passed, the family carrying both love and sorrow in their hearts. The twins were precious, but their blindness hung over the household like a shadow. Everyone in the house, parents, staff, even the twins themselves, believed that nothing could change. It seemed their story was one of endless struggle, where even the glow of wealth could not brighten the darkness they lived in. Yet fate often writes its own chapters. The twins' lives, marked by silence and limitation, were about to be touched by someone unexpected, someone who did not come with wealth or degrees or promises of miracle cures, someone who carried only kindness, patience, and a heart big enough to transform everything. The struggle of the twins was real, painful, and unending. But hidden in that struggle was the seed of a story that would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The mansion stood tall and proud, but inside its walls lived a quiet desperation. The millionaire and his wife had tried to accept their children's blindness, but acceptance did not come easily. For people who were used to controlling their lives, solving problems with money, and bending the world to their will, the twins' condition was something they could not conquer. Doctors came and went like passing seasons. The family spared no expense. Specialists were flown in from Europe, Asia, and America. Surgeons spoke of experimental treatments. Scientists promised miracle breakthroughs. Each time, the parents clung to hope, writing checks with trembling hands, desperate to believe this time would be different. But every visit ended with the same heartbreak. "We're sorry," the doctors would say gently, shaking their heads. "There is no cure. Your children will never see." The mother would leave those appointments with tears running down her face, clutching her twins tightly as though shielding them from the truth. The father, though outwardly calm, would return to his office and sit in silence, staring at the city skyline through the glass windows. His reflection blurred by the tears he refused to let fall in front of others. Inside the home, the weight of despair grew heavier each day. The twins spent much of their time together, speaking in soft voices, their small hands always searching for each other. They moved cautiously through the grand halls, memorizing steps and corners, but fear never left their movements. They longed to explore the gardens, to see the flowers their mother described, to watch the birds they could only hear, but such dreams remained locked in darkness. The parents tried everything to make life easier for them. They filled their playroom with toys that made sounds, talking dolls, music boxes, chimes that jingled when touched. They hired tutors trained in working with children with disabilities. They even brought in music teachers, hoping the twins might find joy in sound if not in sight. And while the children sometimes smiled, sometimes laughed softly, the truth was clear. They were growing more withdrawn, more hesitant, more silent as the years went on. The staff of the mansion noticed it too. The maids whispered to each other in the kitchen. "The children never play outside," one said. "I heard them crying again last night," said another. The gardener, who tended the flowers outside their window, often watched the twins press their faces to the glass, hearing his footsteps but never able to see the roses or lilies he cared for. It broke his heart. The mother tried to keep the house cheerful. She organized family dinners, decorated the children's room with bright colors they could not see, and told them bedtime stories filled with pictures they could not imagine. Her voice was sweet, but her heart ached with every word, because she knew her children were missing something that even her love could not replace. The father threw himself into his work, not because he loved it more, but because it was the only place where he still felt powerful. In the boardroom, his decisions mattered. In his office, his money solved problems. But at home, none of it mattered. He could buy the most expensive toys, the best specialists, even fly the family anywhere in the world. But his children's blindness followed them like a shadow that could not be escaped. This despair began to change the very spirit of the household. The mansion, once filled with laughter and music during parties, became quieter. Guests came less often. The parents avoided social gatherings, tired of the whispered questions and sympathetic glances. The fountains outside still sparkled in the sunlight, but few people came to admire them. The walls were polished, but the air inside was heavy. The twins themselves felt this sadness most of all. Though they could not see the sorrow on their parents' faces, they could feel it in their voices, in the tremble of their touch. Children are sensitive in ways adults don't always understand. They knew they were different. They knew their blindness brought tears to their mother and silence to their father. And in their small hearts, they carried guilt they could not express. At night, the twins would lie in their beds, whispering to each other. "Do you think Mama is sad because of us?" the girl would ask softly. Her brother would hold her hand and say, "No, she loves us. That's all that matters." But deep down, both knew their lives were wrapped in a sadness too big for them to untangle. The desperation was not just about blindness. It was about helplessness. For the first time, money had failed the millionaire. For the first time, love had failed the mother. The twins lived, but not fully. They were alive but not free. And so the days turned into months, and the months into years. The house stood tall, but its halls echoed with loneliness. Every member of the family felt it, but none knew how to change it. The parents prayed for a miracle, never realizing that miracles don't always arrive in the form of doctors or medicines. Sometimes miracles walk into your life quietly, disguised as ordinary people. The family didn't know it yet, but their desperation was leading them toward such a miracle. One that would not come from wealth or science, but from the heart of a woman no one expected to make a difference. A woman who would step into their lives with nothing but kindness and patience, and in doing so transform everything. The mansion had seen many faces come and go. Maids, tutors, cooks, and nannies. Most stayed only for a short while. Some couldn't handle the pressure of working for such a wealthy family. Others left quietly when the weight of the twins' blindness became too heavy to bear. The children weren't difficult or unkind, but their silence, their sadness, and their unpredictable frustrations often made staff uneasy. Over time, the household grew used to change, used to welcoming strangers who rarely lasted long. One afternoon, when the summer sun cast golden light across the marble floors, a new figure walked through the grand front doors. She was young but carried herself with quiet strength. Her clothes were plain, neatly pressed though faded from years of use. Her shoes were scuffed, but her back was straight, her eyes alert. She was not like the polished nannies who had come before, dressed in expensive uniforms and armed with glowing resumes. This woman came from a modest background, perhaps even poor, but there was something in her face, a calmness, a warmth, that immediately set her apart. The housekeeper introduced her to the lady of the house. "Madam, this is Grace. She'll be starting today as the children's maid." The millionaire's wife studied her carefully. She had grown used to disappointment, used to staff members who promised to care but quickly gave up. At first glance, Grace did not look impressive. She didn't have the practiced smile or polished manners of others. But there was something about her presence that felt steady, like a rock in a rushing stream. "You understand the situation with my twins?" the mother asked, her voice tired but firm. "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied softly. "I know they are blind. I also know they are children who need love more than anything else." The words were simple, but they struck the mother in a way she didn't expect. She nodded curtly, though her heart was stirred. "We've tried many before you," she said. "It isn't easy." Grace met her gaze without hesitation. "I don't expect easy. I expect real." And with that, she was welcomed into the mansion. The children were in their room when Grace first met them. The boy and girl sat close together on a rug, their hands entwined, whispering softly to one another as they often did. Their eyes, clouded and unfocused, turned toward the door when they heard footsteps. The mother guided Grace forward. "Children, this is Grace. She will be here to help take care of you." The twins didn't reply right away. They had grown used to introductions, used to voices that came and went, promising care but leaving behind disappointment. Instead, they clutched each other's hands tighter, waiting. Grace didn't rush. She didn't overwhelm them with cheerful greetings or forced excitement. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor, sitting on the rug with them. Her movements were slow, her tone gentle. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Grace. I won't ask you to see me. I know you can't. But I want you to hear me, and I want you to know that I'm here." The twins turned their heads slightly toward her voice. She continued, "You don't have to talk to me yet. You don't have to trust me yet. I'll wait until you're ready." The boy tilted his head, curious. The girl squeezed his hand, whispering, her voice is soft. For the first time in a long while, the mother watching from the doorway felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Grace was not forcing herself into their world. She was stepping gently into it, respecting its boundaries. From that moment, Grace became a quiet presence in the mansion. She didn't fill the air with unnecessary words. She didn't treat the twins like broken dolls to be pitied. Instead, she moved patiently, learning their routines, listening to their whispers, and slowly finding ways to connect. At meals, Instead of guiding their hands forcefully to their plates, she placed food carefully in specific positions, teaching them how to remember where everything was. "Your spoon is at 12 o'clock, she'd say, describing the plate like a clock face. "Your bread is at 3. Your juice is at 6. The children listened, and soon they began to feed themselves with more confidence than before. At bedtime, when the house grew quiet, Grace sat with them, humming lullabies that reminded them of warmth and safety. Her voice was low and steady, filling their dark world with music that gave them comfort. She encouraged them to explore by touch, the texture of the flowers in the garden, the warmth of the sunlight through the window, the sound of the birds in the morning. She opened their world not by sight, but by every other sense they had been too afraid to use. The staff noticed the change first. The twins, who once sat silently holding hands, began to giggle when Grace played simple games with them. They began to ask small questions, their voices louder, their words braver. The mansion, which had grown so heavy with sadness, began to feel lighter. The mother noticed it too. One evening, she passed by the children's room and stopped in the doorway. Grace was on the floor with them, letting them touch her face with their small hands. "This is my nose," Grace said patiently. "And these are my cheeks. Can you feel my smile?" The twins laughed softly as their fingers traced her features. Tears filled the mother's eyes. She had watched doctors, tutors, and nannies try to teach her children with complicated techniques and expensive tools. Yet here was Grace, with no degree, no wealth, no polished background, opening doors money never could. The father, too, began to notice. After long days of work, he returned to a home that felt warmer, filled with the sound of his children's laughter. He sat quietly one evening, watching Grace guide his son's hands over the keys of a piano, teaching him to find notes by touch and sound. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that in years. Grace's arrival was unexpected, unassuming, but slowly, gently, she became the light in a household that had lived in darkness too long. And though no one said it yet, deep down, everyone in that mansion felt it. Something was changing. Something real. Something powerful. At first, the twins kept their distance. They were polite in their own way, nodding when spoken to, answering in short whispers, but they did not trust easily. Too many voices had entered their lives before, voices that promised care only to vanish after a few weeks. To the children, Grace was just another stranger who would eventually leave. But Grace was different. She did not demand their trust. She did not force them to like her. Instead, she gave them time, patience, and presence. Every morning, she greeted them the same way, her voice calm and steady. "Good morning, my sweet ones. It's a brand new day." Even if they didn't respond, she said it anyway. She wanted them to know she was always there, whether they answered or not. She learned their habits quietly. The boy liked to tap his fingers on the table in rhythmic patterns, so Grace began tapping back, creating little songs with him. At first he stopped, surprised, but then he smiled faintly and continued, the rhythm turning into a secret language between them. The girl loved the scent of roses from the garden, though she had never seen their color. Grace would bring her a fresh rose each morning, letting her touch its petals, inhale its fragrance, and feel the tiny thorns carefully under her guidance. Slowly, these little gestures began to break the wall the twins had built around themselves. One afternoon, Grace found them sitting silently in their room, holding hands as they often did. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she sat on the floor near them and began humming softly. The melody was simple, gentle, almost like a lullaby. The boy tilted his head, listening. The girl leaned closer to her brother and whispered, "Her song feels warm." Grace smiled but kept humming, letting the music fill the room. After a while, she stopped and said, "Would you like to sing with me?" The children were quiet for a moment. Then, in soft voices, they tried. At first, it was shy and uneven, but soon their giggles filled the air as they stumbled over the notes. For the first time in a long time, their laughter rang through the mansion. The staff passing in the hallway paused, smiling at the sound they hadn't heard in years. From then on, music became their bridge. Grace sang as she helped them dress, as she guided them through the halls, as she sat with them in the garden. They began to hum along, their voices growing stronger each day. But Grace didn't stop at music. She wanted the twins to explore their world through every sense they had. She took them into the garden, not to describe the flowers they could not see, but to let them feel and smell them. She placed leaves in their hands, letting them discover the smoothness of magnolia, the roughness of oak. She guided their fingers over tree bark, let them feel the breeze brush their cheeks, and encouraged them to listen to the birds chirping above. "This is how you see," she told them softly. "With your hands, your nose, your ears, and your heart." The twins listened carefully. They began to walk with more confidence, their hands stretched out, not in fear but in curiosity. They explored corners of the garden they had once avoided. They giggled when they felt raindrops on their skin, squealed when they dipped their toes in the cool water of the fountain. Their parents noticed the change. The mother, watching from the balcony one morning, covered her mouth with trembling hands as she saw her children laughing, chasing Grace by following the sound of her jingling bracelets. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of gratitude. The father, too, began to see what was happening. He returned home one evening to find his children sitting in the living room with Grace, their hands on a piano. Grace guided them patiently, letting them find the keys by touch. The boy pressed one note, the girl another, and soon a simple, sweet tune filled the room. The father stood frozen in the doorway, his chest tight, his eyes burning. It had been years since he had seen his children so alive. The bond between Grace and the twins grew deeper with each passing day. They began to seek her out, calling her name when they needed help, laughing when she teased them gently, listening closely to her stories. Grace told them tales not of sight but of feeling, stories of the wind carrying secrets, of rivers whispering songs, of stars they could not see but could imagine shining just for them. At night, when she tucked them into bed, they no longer clung only to each other. They reached out for her hand too, their trust now complete. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" the girl asked softly one evening. Grace smiled, brushing her hair back. "Yes, my sweet one. As long as you want me, I'll be here." The boy whispered, "Promise." "I promise," Grace said. For the first time, the twins slept peacefully without tears. The household began to change as well. The staff, once weighed down by sadness, found themselves smiling more. The sound of the children's laughter spread through the halls, lifting spirits. The mansion, once silent and heavy, now carried warmth. Grace's presence was not just noticed, it was felt. The children no longer seemed like fragile figures trapped in darkness. They were explorers, singers, dreamers. All because one woman had chosen to step gently into their world and love them for who they were. The bond was unexpected, but it was real. And though the millionaire and his wife had hired Grace as a maid, they were beginning to realize she was something far more than that. She was a healer of hearts, a bringer of light into their children's darkness. The days that followed Grace's arrival began like whispers, small changes that few noticed at first. But soon, those whispers grew into something undeniable. The twins, who had once lived in silence and hesitation, were slowly, carefully stepping into a world that had always felt close to them. Grace never rushed them. She built their confidence piece by piece, like a patient artist shaping clay. She didn't treat them as fragile or helpless, but as children capable of discovery. And in her presence, they began to discover themselves. One morning, she guided them into the garden, a place they had rarely ventured before. In the past, the outdoors had been overwhelming. Too many sounds, too much space. But Grace held their hands gently and said, "Let's see the world in a different way today." She bent down and guided the boy's fingers to the rough bark of a tree. "Feel this," she whispered. "This tree has been standing here longer than we've been alive. Strong, steady, unshaken." The boy's fingers traced the ridges, and for the first time, he smiled at the thought of something being so strong. For his sister, Grace plucked a handful of lavender and placed it in her palm. "Now smell," she encouraged. The girl lifted it to her nose, her lips curving upward. "It smells happy," she said softly, and Grace laughed gently. "Yes, darling. Flowers have moods too, and today they're happy." Step by step, the twins began to walk more freely in the garden. At first, they clung to Grace's arms, but slowly they learned to stretch their hands out in front of them, trusting the sound of her voice to guide them. The staff who watched from the windows were astonished. The same children who once sat quietly indoors were now laughing as they felt raindrops splash against their cheeks, squealing as they dipped their toes into the fountain's cool water. Inside the mansion, the change was just as striking. Grace taught them independence in ways their parents had never imagined. At mealtimes, instead of feeding them spoon by spoon, she described their plates like a clock. "Your spoon is at 12 o'clock, your bread is at 3, your juice is at 6, she explained patiently. At first, their movements were clumsy. Juice spilled, spoons dropped. But Grace never scolded them. She clapped softly at every small success. "You did it. See how capable you are." The twins grew bolder with each meal. Soon they no longer needed her hand over theirs. They began to feed themselves confidently, their faces glowing with pride. Their parents, watching quietly from across the table, were stunned. For years they had believed their children would always be dependent. But here they were, growing in strength and self-reliance. Grace also unlocked something even more magical: joy. She introduced music as a language of freedom. Sitting by the piano one evening, she placed the boy's hands on the keys. "Don't worry about playing it right," she whispered. "Just let the sound guide you." He pressed a key, startled by the note that rang out. His sister giggled and pressed another. Soon, their small hands were exploring the keys, creating simple tunes. Grace clapped along, humming with them, turning noise into laughter. The mansion, once heavy with silence, now echoed with music and giggles. The maids passing in the hallway would pause just to listen, smiling as they heard the twins experimenting with sounds. Even the father, who often retreated into his office to hide his sorrow, found himself drawn to the music. One evening, he stood in the doorway of the living room, watching Grace guide his children's hands over the piano keys. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized this was the first time in years he had seen his children so alive. The transformation wasn't just in skills, it was in spirit. The twins no longer clung to each other as if the world beyond was too frightening. They began to speak more, ask questions, laugh at Grace's gentle jokes. They started to look forward to each day instead of fearing it. The mother, who had once cried herself to sleep, now found herself pausing outside her children's door at night, listening to their soft chatter before they drifted off to sleep. Instead of whispers of sadness, she heard them sharing little dreams, imagining what stars might sound like if they could sing, or how the ocean might feel under their toes. Grace had given them not just confidence but imagination. Even the staff felt the shift. The gardener, who had often seen the twins press their faces sadly against the windows, now watched them walk with grace among the flowers, their hands brushing petals, their laughter filling the air. The cook, who once prepared meals that ended in frustration, now delighted in hearing the children praise the taste of bread they buttered themselves. The mansion was no longer just a palace of wealth. It was becoming a home full of life again. The parents were overwhelmed by what they saw. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, the mother turned to her husband with tears in her eyes. "Do you see it? Do you see what she's done?" Her voice trembled with wonder. "They're changing. They're happy." The father nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. For years, he had believed money could solve every problem. Yet it wasn't wealth that had transformed his children. It was Grace. Her patience, her compassion, her willingness to step into their darkness and light a candle. The transformation was just beginning, but already the family knew something extraordinary was happening. The twins were no longer defined only by their blindness. They were learning to live, to laugh, to trust, and above all, to thrive. The mansion had always been a place of wealth and grandeur, but for years it had felt heavy, almost like a beautiful cage filled with silence. The twins' struggles had cast a shadow over the household, and no matter how polished the marble floors were or how brightly the chandeliers sparkled, There was an emptiness that nothing could cover. But ever since Grace had begun working there, that silence had started to crack. At first, it was small things. The sound of soft laughter drifting through the halls, or the faint notes of piano keys echoing at night. The staff, who had grown used to sadness, began exchanging surprised glances whenever they heard the children giggling or singing along with Grace. One morning, the head butler paused in the corridor outside the playroom. He leaned closer, hardly believing his ears. Inside, the twins were clapping their hands in rhythm as Grace sang an old folk song. Their laughter bubbled out like water from a spring, pure and unrestrained. For a moment, the butler's stern face softened. "It's been years," he whispered to himself. "Years since I've heard them laugh like that." The maids noticed too. They whispered in the kitchen as they polished silverware. "Have you seen them lately?" one asked in disbelief. "They were in the garden yesterday," another replied, smiling. "Actually running, well, carefully, but running with Grace guiding them. Can you imagine? They never even stepped outside before." Even the cook, who had once felt pity setting plates before children who barely touched their food, now found joy in his work. One afternoon, the twins, with Grace's help, prepared a simple batch of bread. Their hands were messy with flour, their faces smeared with streaks of dough, but they laughed the whole time. Later, as they proudly tasted the bread they had helped bake, the cook stood back and wiped his eyes with the corner of his apron. "They're alive again," he murmured. The transformation spread beyond the staff. The parents themselves were stunned almost daily. The mother, who had lived in constant sorrow, now walked through the house with lighter steps. One evening, she passed by the piano room and froze at the door. Inside, Grace sat with the twins, guiding their hands over the keys. The boy pressed a note, the girl pressed another, and together they formed a clumsy but beautiful tune. Grace clapped softly, praising them, and the children laughed proudly at their little song. Tears welled in the mother's eyes as she pressed a hand to her heart. For so long she had dreamed of hearing such joy. Now it was real. The father, a man who rarely let emotions show, began to soften as well. After long hours of business, he returned home expecting the usual quiet sadness. But instead, he found his children in the garden, laughing as Grace let them explore the different plants. The boy shouted, "This one feels rough," as he ran his hand over tree bark. The girl giggled, "This one smells sweet," holding a sprig of lavender. The father stood silently for a moment, watching, then turned away quickly to hide the tears burning in his eyes. It wasn't only the family and staff who noticed. Visitors began to whisper too. One afternoon, a business associate of the father came for a meeting. As he was escorted through the halls, he paused when he heard laughter coming from the playroom. "Are those your children?" he asked, surprised. The father nodded, his lips curving into a small, proud smile. For years, he had dreaded such questions, afraid of the pity that usually followed. But now he felt something different. Pride. His children were no longer silent shadows in the house. They were vibrant, living souls. The most shocked of all, however, was the household itself. The mansion, once cold despite its beauty, now seemed warmer. The sound of the children's voices reached every corner. The staff moved with lighter steps. Meals were no longer heavy with silence but filled with conversation and laughter. Even the walls seemed to echo differently, carrying not just wealth but life. And at the center of it all was Grace. She never boasted about her work. She never sought credit. She simply did what came naturally, listening, guiding, loving with patience. But everyone could see the truth. She had done what money, doctors, and tutors had never been able to do. She had transformed the twins from withdrawn, silent children into curious, joyful ones. The mother confided to her husband one night, her voice trembling with wonder. "Do you see it? Do you feel it? Our home is alive again. And it's because of her." The father, once skeptical, nodded slowly. "I used to believe money could solve anything. But what she has given us, no wealth in the world could buy." The twins themselves felt the change most of all. They no longer clung only to each other out of fear. They trusted Grace now, laughed with her, explored with her. They began to dream out loud, imagining what the stars might sound like, what colors might feel like if they had textures. They were no longer bound only by what they lacked. They were free in the world Grace had opened for them. The household was shocked, yes, but more than shocked, it was humbled. Wealth had built the mansion, but Grace had given it life. And though no one said it aloud, every heart in that house knew the truth. The new maid had not just changed the children. She had transformed them all. The twins had been changing day by day, but the parents didn't fully realize the depth of the transformation until one evening when the family gathered in the grand living room. The fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting a warm glow on the high ceilings and gold-framed paintings. The father sat in his armchair, his mind still heavy with business worries, while the mother gently stroked her daughter's hair. Grace entered quietly with the boy, guiding him by the hand. "Would you like to show your parents what we practiced?" she asked gently. The boy hesitated, his cloudy eyes turning toward the sound of her voice. His sister squeezed his hand encouragingly. Then, together, the twins walked slowly to the piano that stood polished and untouched for years in the corner of the room. Grace sat with them, placing their small hands on the keys. The parents leaned forward, curious. Then, to their astonishment, the twins began to play a simple melody. It was not perfect, the notes stumbled, the rhythm uneven, but it was music. Their music. The boy pressed the lower keys while his sister found the higher ones, their laughter bubbling each time they made a mistake. Grace hummed along softly, guiding them back into the rhythm. The mother covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She could hardly believe it. Her children, who had once sat silently in darkness, were creating music that filled the entire room with life. The father's eyes burned as he watched, pride swelling in his chest in a way he hadn't felt in years. When the song ended, the twins clapped for themselves, giggling. "We did it!" the girl shouted happily. "We played a song." The mother rushed forward, gathering them into her arms. "Yes, my darlings," she whispered through tears. "You did it. You truly did." But as she held them, her eyes shifted toward Grace. Their maid stood quietly behind the children, her expression calm, her hands folded humbly. She had no need to claim credit, no need to boast. Yet the mother knew. It was Grace who had taught them. Grace who had been patient when others gave up. Grace who had given them courage when even their parents couldn't. That night, after the children had been tucked into bed with smiles still on their faces, the parents asked Grace to sit with them in the study. The father, a man who rarely lowered his pride, stood awkwardly at first. He cleared his throat, searching for words. Finally, he said, "Grace, what you have done for our children, for us, I don't even know how to begin." The mother's voice was gentler, full of emotion. "We hired you as a maid, but you've become so much more. You've done what money, doctors, and tutors could not. You've brought our children back to life." Grace lowered her gaze, shaking her head lightly. "I didn't do anything magical, ma'am. I only gave them what they already had inside them. A chance to grow, a chance to laugh. They are strong children. I only reminded them." The father stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Don't diminish it. You gave them hope when even we, their parents, were losing it. You gave them confidence when the world gave them none. You reminded us of something money cannot buy." There was a long pause. The mother reached across the table, placing her hand over Grace's. "You've become part of this family," she whispered. "Not just staff, not just help. Family." For a woman who had spent her life in humble work, who had known what it meant to be overlooked, Grace felt her eyes sting with tears. She nodded softly, her heart full but her voice steady. "Thank you. I only did what love asked me to do." In the days that followed, the gratitude only deepened. The father, once buried in work, began to spend more evenings with his children, guided by Grace's methods. He learned to play tapping games with his son, to describe food by the clock method so they could eat independently, to listen to music with them rather than working in silence. The mother began to smile more, her laughter returning as she joined Grace in the garden with the twins, watching them explore scents and textures. The staff, too, treated Grace with newfound respect. They no longer saw her as just another maid passing through. They whispered in admiration about the way she had transformed the household, calling her the heart of the home. Visitors noticed the difference as well. Business partners who once tiptoed around the subject of the children now saw them laughing, humming, and proudly walking through the halls with newfound confidence. And each time, the parents gave credit where it was due, to Grace. The gratitude was not just in words, but in actions. The family began to include Grace in their meals, seating her at the table when before she would have eaten in the kitchen. They celebrated her birthday with a cake and gifts, something no employer had ever done for her before. The twins clung to her not as staff, but as someone they loved dearly, calling her our Grace. The millionaire, once proud and unbending, even admitted one evening, "I thought wealth could solve everything. But today I realize compassion solves more than wealth ever can. You've taught me that." Grace only smiled humbly, but deep inside, she knew she had found her place. Not just in the mansion, but in the lives of two children who now saw the world not through their eyes, but through their hearts. Recognition had come. Gratitude had been spoken. But more than that, a bond had been sealed. One that no wealth, no loss, no circumstance could ever break. Seasons changed, but the glow that Grace had brought into the mansion did not fade. What once was a house of silence and sorrow had now become a place of life, laughter, and discovery. The fountains outside still sparkled in the sunlight, the chandeliers still glittered at night, but now those luxuries were no longer the focus. The true treasures of the home were the sounds of the twins' voices, singing, giggling, asking endless questions, and the calm, steady voice of Grace guiding them. The twins had transformed. They no longer sat huddled together in fear, clutching each other's hands as if the world outside was too frightening. Now they explored with confidence. They walked through the garden counting their steps, smelling roses and lavender, touching bark and leaves, laughing whenever Grace encouraged them to see with their fingers. They sat at the piano almost every evening, creating little tunes that filled the mansion with warmth. Even their conversations had changed, from whispers filled with worry to dreams painted with imagination. "What do stars sound like?" the girl would ask. "Maybe they hum," her brother would answer, and together they would giggle at the thought. The parents watched these changes with awe. The mother, who had once cried quietly in the night, now smiled as she tucked her children into bed. The father, who once hid behind his work, now spent more time at home, sitting with his children, listening to their stories, and realizing that the truest form of success was not in business, but in family. But it wasn't just the family that learned. The staff, too, had been changed by Grace's presence. The butler, once stiff and reserved, now bent down to play tapping games with the boy when he passed him in the hall. The cook, who once prepared meals in silence, now let the children help in the kitchen, laughing as flour dusted their noses. The gardeners, who once only saw the twins from afar, now guided them gently through the flower beds, letting them feel petals, taste herbs, and hear the buzzing of bees. The mansion itself seemed to breathe again, alive in ways no wealth had ever given it before. And the parents never forgot the truth. All of this had been sparked not by money, but by the maid they had once doubted. Grace had come into their lives quietly, with no promises, no riches, no polished background. She had nothing but patience, humility, and love. And yet, she had given their children more than the greatest doctors in the world ever could. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the father spoke softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I built this house with money. I built my empire with hard work. But I see now that true wealth has nothing to do with any of that. True wealth is here." He placed his hand gently on his daughter's head, then his son's shoulder. "True wealth is love, kindness, and the people who remind us of it." Grace, sitting quietly nearby, lowered her eyes. She never wanted recognition, never asked for praise. But in that moment, she felt the weight of his words settle in her heart. The mother reached across and took Grace's hand. "You came into our home as a maid," she said with tears in her eyes. "But you became our family. You didn't just change our children. You changed us." The twins, not fully understanding the depth of their parents' words, hugged Grace tightly. "Our Grace," they said in unison, smiling. From then on, no one in that mansion saw her as the maid. She was their anchor, their guide, their light in the darkness. She had taught them all that love is not measured by what you have, but by what you give. And that was the lasting lesson. For the children, the lesson was that blindness did not mean the end of joy. They learned to see with their hearts, to explore with their other senses, and to live without fear. For the parents, the lesson was humility. They learned that money could not solve every problem, that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. For the staff, the lesson was compassion. They learned to look beyond appearances and recognize the power of patience and kindness. The mansion remained grand, but its true beauty was no longer in marble floors or golden chandeliers. It was in the sound of laughter, the music of piano keys, the songs hummed by Grace and echoed by the children. Long after that chapter of their lives began, people who visited the family noticed something extraordinary. They noticed that the twins, though blind, carried themselves with joy, confidence, and peace. And they noticed the quiet woman who stayed beside them always, guiding them not just through rooms, but through life. The millionaire and his wife often shared their story with others. "We thought we had everything," they would say, "but we had nothing until we learned what Grace taught us, that love can transform even the darkest world into light." And so the story of the millionaire's twins, once defined only by struggle, became a story of transformation. A story where the simplest heart gave the greatest gift. A story where blindness did not mean the absence of life, but the beginning of seeing in new ways. It was a story that left behind a lesson for everyone who heard it. That compassion is more valuable than wealth. That patience is stronger than despair. And that sometimes the person you least expect is the one who can transform everything.